Saghir. Even after the lapse of around a century, the situation of the Kashmiri people has not improved. Their majority is still oppressed, though the oppressors have changed names. Mr. Speaker, the Jammu and Kashmir dispute is one of the oldest unresolved international disputes. It has been on the agenda of the UN Security Council since 1948 under the Indian-Pakistan question. The UN Security Council resolution on Jammu and Kashmir affirmed the right of the Kashmiri people to self-determination. Regrettably, these resolutions have not been implemented during the last 7.5 decades. Instead, the current Indian government is bent upon consolidating its occupation of this internationally recognized disputed territory through a series of legislative and administrative measures. Contortions, convulsions, outright lies, and brutal use of indiscriminate force would be a more appropriate way of describing these reprehensible measures. Mr. Speaker, history cannot be undone. It was India that took the Jammu and Kashmir dispute to the United Nations. One of India's founding fathers and its first Prime Minister, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, is on record to assure the Kashmiri people multiple times of a plebiscite to determine their free will. In his letter of 21st November 1947, addressed to the Prime Minister of Pakistan, he categorically stated that Kashmiris should decide the question of accession by plebiscite or referendum under international auspices such as those of the United Nations. The subsequent Indian governments also acknowledged Jammu and Kashmir as a dispute. How can India's current leadership renege from these promises now? India must honor its long-standing and solemn commitment to the United Nations, to Pakistan, and above all, to the Kashmiri people. Regarding the plebiscite, the commitments under UN Security Council resolutions are sacrosanct and not affected by the limitations of time or space. Mr. Speaker, today I stand before you to reaffirm Pakistan's unwavering commitment to the Kashmiri people at this critical moment in the history of their struggle against foreign subjugation in their legitimate and freely chosen legislature. I'm here to express solidarity with them in the wake of a grave injustice 3 days ago in a decision that was politically motivated rather than grounded in law. The Supreme Court of India validated the Indian government's illegal and unilateral measures of 5th August 2019. This unjust verdict was delivered by the apex court of the world's so-called largest democracy. In fact, the title of the world's largest democracy is a misnomer. Instead, India should be called the world's largest hypocrisy, where hollow slogans of secularism, democracy, and diversity are raised to cover up caste-based societal operation, systematic intimidation and marginalization of minorities, state-sponsored killings and terrorism, and illegal occupation of people and territory. Ironically, the self-proclaimed largest democracy of the world is afraid of granting the democratic right of a plebiscite to ascertain the will of the Kashmiri people. Mr. Speaker, India's unilateral and illegal measure of 5th August 2019 and a series of subsequent steps have been aimed at changing the demographic structure and political landscape of the Indian illegal occupied Jammu and Kashmir. These measures constitute a flagrant violation of international law as well as the UN Security Council resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir. They remain a matter of grave concern as their ultimate goal is to convert the Kashmiris into a disempowered community in their own land. Deplorably, India's Supreme Court has endorsed these steps. Mr. Speaker, the successive Indian actions in illegal Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir constitute a breach of the UN Charter, UN Security Council resolutions, and international law, including the 4th Geneva Convention. Amongst others, the UN Security Council Resolution 122 of 1957, accepted by India, unambiguously declares that final disposition of the state of Jammu and Kashmir will be made in accordance with the will of the people expressed through the democratic method of a free and impartial plebiscite conducted under the auspices of the United Nations. The resolution further provides that any action by the erstwhile India-imposed Constituent Assembly of Jammu and Kashmir to determine the final shape and disposition of the state would not constitute a disposition of the state in accordance with the said principle. The Indian government's actions of 5th August 2019, endorsed by its Supreme Court, are in a clear violation of these provisions. Evidently, India's administrative, political, and legal measures, including a series of sham elections, Article 370 of its constitution, abolition of this article in 2019, and now the Indian Supreme Court's verdict, are mere tools to consolidate its occupation. Domestic legislation and judicial verdicts cannot absolve India of its international obligations under the UN Security Council resolutions. In the eyes of international law, any process subservient to the Indian Constitution cannot be invoked to determine the final status of Jammu and Kashmir. On the one hand, India has a grandiose vision of its place in the Committee of Nations. On the other, it implements a grotesque plot to subjugate foreign people and territories. It wishes to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council. However, its leadership takes pride in trampling upon international law and the UN Security Council resolutions. These contradictions, reinforced by the ideology of Hindutva, should serve as an eye